The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training grounds as General Marcus Richardson stepped out of his black sedan. At 58 years old, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had spent 4 decades climbing the ranks of the United States Army. His chest displayed an impressive collection of medals and ribbons, each one representing a battle fought, a mission completed, or a moment of exceptional service to his country. Richardson had earned his reputation as one of the most demanding and effective training commanders in the military. Soldiers under his command either emerged as elite warriors or were weeded out during the grueling process he had perfected over the years. His methods were controversial, but his results spoke for themselves. The graduation rate from his programs was low, but those who made it through became some of the finest soldiers the Army had ever produced. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, the general was in an especially foul mood. He had received a phone call the previous evening from the Pentagon, informing him that his training methods were under review. Some complaints had been filed by parents of trainees, claiming that his approach was too harsh and bordered on abuse. The very suggestion that his time-tested methods were inappropriate had sent his blood pressure soaring. The training facility sprawled across 200 acres of carefully maintained grounds. Obstacle courses, firing ranges, and barracks dotted the landscape like pieces on a giant chessboard. This was Richardson's kingdom, and he ruled it with an iron fist. Every blade of grass, every piece of equipment, every schedule was maintained according to his exact specifications. As he walked toward the main training area, his aide, Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson, hurried to keep pace beside him. Peterson had served under Richardson for 3 years and had learned to read the subtle signs of his commander's moods. Today, those signs were not subtle at all. The general's jaw was clenched, his eyes were narrowed, and his usual brisk walk had turned into an aggressive march. "Sir, the morning briefing is ready whenever you are," Peterson said carefully, knowing that any wrong word could trigger an explosion of anger. Richardson grunted in response, his attention focused on the group of trainees who were beginning their morning exercises in the distance. These were new recruits, barely 3 weeks into their training program. Most of them were 18 or 19 years old, fresh out of high school, with dreams of serving their country and proving their worth as soldiers. The training program they had entered was known throughout the military as Richardson's Crucible. It was designed to break down civilians and rebuild them as disciplined military personnel. The process was intentionally brutal, combining physical challenges, mental stress, and psychological pressure to identify those with the fortitude to serve in elite units. As the general approached the training area, he could hear the drill instructors shouting commands at the sweating recruits. The young men and women were running through a series of exercises designed to test their endurance, coordination, and ability to follow orders under pressure. Most were struggling, their faces red with exertion and their breathing labored. Richardson's eyes scanned the group, cataloging each trainee's performance with the precision of a machine. He had developed an ability over the years to quickly identify which recruits had potential and which were likely to wash out. It was a skill that had served him well throughout his career, but it had also made him increasingly impatient with those he deemed unworthy of the uniform. In the center of the group, one particular trainee caught his attention. Private Tommy Martinez was a slight young man from a small town in Texas. At 19 years old, he weighed barely 140 pounds and stood just 5 feet 6 inches tall. He had enlisted against his parents' wishes, determined to prove that his size didn't define his capabilities. Martinez was struggling more than most. The physical demands of the training program were pushing him to his absolute limits, and it showed. His face was pale despite the exertion, and his movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated as fatigue set in. Several times during the morning exercises, he had fallen behind the group, forcing the drill instructors to wait for him to catch up. What made matters worse was Martinez's obvious determination to succeed despite his physical limitations. He refused to quit, pushing himself harder and harder even as his body began to fail him. This combination of weakness and stubbornness was exactly the type of thing that triggered Richardson's anger. The general had seen hundreds of recruits like Martinez over the years, young men who had watched too many movies and developed unrealistic expectations about military life. In Richardson's view, these recruits were not only wasting their own time, but also endangering their fellow soldiers by taking up spots that could have gone to more qualified candidates. As he watched Martinez stumble through another exercise, Richardson felt his anger building. The phone call from the Pentagon, the criticism of his methods, and now this pathetic display of incompetence combined to create a perfect storm of rage within him. The morning training session was reaching its climax with a timed obstacle course run. Each recruit was required to complete the course within a specific time limit or face additional punishment exercises. The course itself was a brutal test of agility, strength, and mental toughness, featuring rope climbs, wall scaling, crawling under barbed wire, and navigating through various physical challenges. Martinez was among the last group to attempt the course. As he approached the starting line, his legs were already shaking from the previous exercises. The drill instructors, Sergeant First Class Williams and Staff Sergeant Chun, positioned themselves at key points along the course to observe and time each recruit's performance. "Move it, Martinez," Williams shouted as the young recruit began his run. "My grandmother could complete this course faster than you." The first obstacle was a series of hurdles that required quick footwork and coordination. Martinez cleared the first few successfully, but his fatigue was evident in his increasingly clumsy movements. By the fourth hurdle, he clipped the top with his trailing foot, nearly losing his balance and precious seconds. Next came the rope climb, a 20-foot ascent that tested upper body strength and technique. Martinez grabbed the rope and began his climb, but his slight frame worked against him. Each pull upward was a struggle, and he could feel his grip weakening with every foot of progress. Halfway up, he paused to rest, dangling from the rope like a flag in still air. "Don't stop, Martinez," Chin yelled from below. "Keep moving." The recruit forced himself to continue climbing, his face contorted with effort. When he finally reached the top and rang the bell that signaled completion of the obstacle, he had already exceeded the recommended time limit for that portion of the course. The descent was even more challenging. Martinez's arms were burning from the climb, and his grip on the rope was tenuous at best. He slid down faster than he intended, the rope burning his hands through his gloves. When he hit the ground, he stumbled and nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment. General Richardson had moved closer to observe the performance, his expression growing darker with each passing minute. He stood with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face were visibly twitching. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson remained a respectful distance behind, recognizing the warning signs of an impending eruption. The next series of obstacles included a wall climb, a balance beam traverse, and a crawl under simulated barbed wire. Martinez approached each challenge with determination, but his body was betraying him. His movements were becoming increasingly erratic, and sweat was pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. At the wall climb, which stood 12 feet high and required recruits to pull themselves up and over using only their upper body strength, Martinez made 3 attempts before successfully clearing it. Each failure drew increasingly harsh criticism from the drill instructors, who were following the established protocol for motivation through aggressive encouragement. "What are you doing, Martinez?" Williams screamed. "Are you trying to embarrass yourself and this entire unit?" The balance beam, a simple test of coordination and focus, became another source of frustration. Martinez stepped onto the narrow wooden beam and immediately began wobbling. His arms windmilled as he fought to maintain his balance, taking small, hesitant steps forward. Twice he fell off and had to restart, adding more time to his already dismal performance. By the time he reached the crawling portion of the course, Martinez was operating on pure willpower alone. The obstacle required recruits to army crawl under a network of ropes and simulated barbed wire for 30 yards. It was designed to simulate battlefield conditions where soldiers might need to move stealthily under enemy observation. Martinez dropped to his belly and began to crawl, but his technique was poor and his progress was painfully slow. His elbows and knees scraped against the rough ground as he pulled himself forward, and several times he raised his body too high, catching his equipment on the overhead obstacles. General Richardson's patience finally snapped. The combination of Martinez's poor performance, his own stress from the Pentagon review, and his fundamental belief that unqualified recruits were weakening the military created a moment of explosive anger that would change everything. He strode forward, his heavy boots making sharp impacts against the packed earth of the training ground. The drill instructors immediately noticed his approach and snapped to attention, recognizing that their commanding officer was about to intervene directly. "Martinez!" Richardson's voice boomed across the training area, causing the struggling recruit to freeze in place. "Get up, now!" The young man scrambled to his feet, his uniform covered in dirt, and his face flushed with exhaustion and embarrassment. He stood at attention as best he could manage, though his body was still trembling from the physical exertion of the course. Richardson closed the distance between them in quick, angry strides. His face was red with fury, and his eyes blazed with an intensity that made everyone in the immediate area step back instinctively. The other recruits who had been waiting their turn to attempt the course watched in stunned silence as their commanding general approached the struggling trainee. "Do you think this is some kind of game, son?" Richardson demanded, his voice loud enough to be heard across the entire training ground. "Do you think the enemy is going to wait for you to catch your breath?" Martinez tried to respond, but Richardson cut him off with a sharp gesture. The general's anger had reached a boiling point, fueled by weeks of frustration with bureaucratic interference, years of dealing with what he considered substandard recruits, and a lifetime of believing that only the strongest deserved to wear the uniform. What happened next would become the single most defining moment of Richardson's career, and the catalyst for a chain of events that would ultimately destroy everything he had worked to build. In his rage, the general would make a decision that took less than 5 seconds to execute, but would have consequences that lasted for years. The other trainees formed an unconscious circle around the confrontation, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. They had all heard stories about General Richardson's legendary temper, but none of them had witnessed it firsthand. The drill instructors remained at attention, unsure whether to intervene or allow their commanding officer to handle the situation as he saw fit. Martinez stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he had been trained to do when being addressed by a superior officer. Despite his exhaustion and obvious distress, he maintained his military bearing, waiting for whatever punishment or criticism was about to be delivered. The tension in the air was palpable as Richardson stepped even closer to the young recruit, close enough that Martinez could feel the heat radiating from the general's angry face. Everyone present sensed that something significant was about to happen, though none of them could have predicted the exact nature of what was coming. In that moment, General Marcus Richardson, decorated veteran of 3 wars and respected military leader, was about to make the biggest mistake of his distinguished career. The silence stretched across the training ground like a held breath. General Richardson stood less than 2 feet from Private Martinez, his chest rising and falling with controlled fury. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across both men's faces, creating a stark tableau that would be burned into the memories of everyone present. Martinez remained at attention, but small details betrayed his exhaustion and fear. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, his hands trembled slightly at his sides, and his breathing was still labored from the obstacle course. He was a young man pushed far beyond his physical limits, standing before one of the most powerful figures in the military hierarchy. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, soldier," Richardson commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Martinez shifted his gaze to meet the general's eyes, a movement that required tremendous courage given the intimidating presence before him. What he saw there was not just anger, but a cold assessment that seemed to weigh his very worth as a human being. "You are everything that is wrong with today's military," Richardson continued, his words precise and cutting. "Weak, unprepared, and completely unwilling to push yourself beyond your pathetic comfort zone." The watching recruits exchanged nervous glances. They had all experienced harsh criticism from their drill instructors, but this felt different. This was personal, and it was escalating beyond anything they had witnessed before. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson shifted uncomfortably behind the general, recognizing that the situation was moving into dangerous territory. He had seen Richardson lose his temper before, but there was something different about this moment. The general's anger seemed more focused, more personal than usual. Sir, Martinez finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I'm trying my best, sir. The words seemed to strike Richardson like a physical blow. His face darkened further, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The concept of trying your best, when that best was clearly inadequate, represented everything he despised about modern military training standards. Your best. Richardson's voice rose to a roar that echoed across the training ground. Your best isn't worth the dirt under my boots, son. Your best is going to get good soldiers killed when you can't keep up in combat. The psychological pressure on Martinez was immense. He was 19 years old, far from home, surrounded by strangers, and being systematically torn down by a figure who represented the entire military establishment. His jaw began to tremble, not just from physical exhaustion, but from the emotional weight of the verbal assault. You want to know what your problem is, Martinez? Richardson continued, stepping even closer. You think you deserve to be here. You think that just because you signed a piece of paper and showed up, that makes you a soldier. The general's voice dropped to a menacing whisper that somehow carried more threat than his previous shouting. But you're not a soldier. You're a liability, and liabilities get removed. What happened next unfolded in a series of moments that seemed to stretch endlessly while simultaneously passing in the blink of an eye. Richardson's anger, building for weeks and focused by the morning's frustrations, finally found its release in an act that would define the rest of his life. Martinez, overwhelmed by the psychological pressure and physical exhaustion, made the mistake of breaking military bearing. His lower lip began to quiver, his eyes filled with tears, and his carefully maintained posture began to crumble. To Richardson, this display of weakness represented the ultimate failure of military discipline. Are you about to cry, soldier? Richardson demanded, his voice filled with disgust. Are you actually going to stand there and cry like a child? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Martinez tried to regain his composure, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand and straightening his shoulders. But the damage was done. In Richardson's mind, the young recruit had revealed himself to be exactly what he had suspected from the beginning, a weak civilian playing at being a soldier. I asked you a question, Martinez, Richardson pressed, his voice growing more menacing. Are you going to cry? No, sir, Martinez managed to say, though his voice cracked slightly on the words. No, sir, Richardson repeated mockingly. Then, what do you call that pathetic display I just witnessed? The general's anger had reached a crescendo, fed by his frustration with the Pentagon Review, his disappointment in what he saw as the declining standards of military recruits, and his personal belief that weakness needed to be confronted directly and aggressively. In that moment of white-hot rage, General Marcus Richardson made a decision that took exactly 5 seconds to execute, but would haunt him for the rest of his life. He drew back his right hand and delivered a sharp, open-handed slap across Private Martinez's face. The sound of the impact cracked across the training ground like a gunshot. Martinez's head snapped to the side, and a red mark immediately began to form on his cheek. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The entire scene seemed frozen in time, as if the universe itself was processing what had just occurred. The watching recruits stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. They had never seen a commanding officer strike an enlisted soldier, and the wrongness of the moment was immediately apparent to everyone present. The drill instructors remained paralyzed, uncertain how to respond to such an unprecedented breach of military protocol. Martinez himself seemed momentarily disconnected from reality. His hand slowly rose to touch his stinging cheek, his eyes blinking rapidly as he tried to process what had just happened to him. The physical pain was significant, but the psychological impact was overwhelming. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson felt his stomach drop as he witnessed the career-ending mistake his commanding officer had just made. He knew immediately that everything was about to change, not just for Richardson, but for everyone connected to the training facility. Richardson himself seemed to realize what he had done almost immediately after the impact. His hand remained extended for a moment before slowly dropping to his side. The rage that had been driving him began to ebb, replaced by a creeping awareness of the magnitude of his error. But it was too late. The deed was done, and there was no taking it back. Get back to your barracks, Richardson said quietly, his voice now lacking the explosive anger that had characterized it moments before. "All of you." The recruits began to disperse slowly, moving with the uncertain shuffle of people who had witnessed something they knew they shouldn't have seen. Many of them cast glances back over their shoulders as they walked away, still processing the reality of what they had observed. Martinez remained standing where he was, his hand still pressed against his cheek. He seemed unable to move, as if the slap had not only struck his face but had also severed his connection to the normal flow of time and space. "Martinez," Richardson said, and there was something different in his voice now. The anger was gone, replaced by what might have been regret or simply the recognition of consequences to come. "Go to your barracks." The young recruit finally moved, walking away with uncertain steps and his head down. He moved like someone in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, still trying to understand how a morning training exercise had transformed into something that felt fundamentally wrong. As the training ground emptied, Richardson found himself alone with Peterson and the two drill instructors. The silence that settled over the area was different from the tense quiet that had preceded the incident. This was the silence of people trying to figure out what to do next in an unprecedented situation. "Sir," Peterson began carefully, knowing that his next words needed to be chosen with extreme caution. "I know," Richardson cut him off, his voice flat and tired. "I know what just happened." The general's anger had completely evaporated, leaving behind a man who was beginning to understand the full implications of his actions. In his 4 decades of military service, he had never struck an enlisted soldier. He had never allowed his emotions to override his judgment in such a spectacular fashion. "What are your orders, sir?" Sergeant Williams asked, his voice professional but tinged with uncertainty. Richardson didn't answer immediately. He stood looking at the obstacle course where Martinez had struggled, replaying the last few minutes in his mind, and searching for some way to undo what had been done. But there was no going back. In the distance, the sound of vehicles could be heard approaching the training facility. The normal rhythm of military life was continuing around them, oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed forever. The general finally turned and began walking back toward his office, his shoulders slightly hunched and his pace much slower than his usual confident stride. Peterson and the drill instructors followed at a respectful distance, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed and what it might mean for their careers. What none of them realized yet was that Private Martinez's older brother, Captain Eduardo Martinez, was currently serving as a military liaison to several news organizations. Eduardo had been working to improve the military's public image and had developed relationships with journalists who specialized in covering military affairs. When Tommy Martinez called his brother that evening, still shaken by his experience and unsure what to do about it, Eduardo's reaction was immediate and decisive. He knew that what had happened was not just wrong, but potentially criminal. More importantly, he understood that his brother's experience was likely not isolated, and that other recruits might be suffering similar treatment. Meanwhile, at the training facility, Richardson sat in his office staring at the commendations and photographs that lined his walls. Each image told a story of achievement, dedication, and service to his country. But now, all of that seemed overshadowed by a single moment of lost control. He kept replaying the incident in his mind, searching for some justification for his actions or some way to minimize what had occurred. But every time he closed his eyes, he could see Martinez's face and hear the crack of his hand making contact with the young recruit's cheek. The phone on his desk remained silent, but Richardson knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. In the modern military, incidents like this didn't remain secret. There were procedures, investigations, and consequences that followed as inevitably as night followed day. As the sun began to set over the training facility, casting long shadows across the now empty obstacle course, General Richardson faced the first night of what would prove to be the final chapter of his military career. The slap that had taken 5 seconds to deliver was about to unleash consequences that would unfold over months and years, ultimately destroying not just his career, but the entire system he had spent his life building. The dominoes had been set in motion, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first crack in General Richardson's carefully constructed world came exactly 18 hours after the incident. He was reviewing morning reports in his office when his aide knocked on the door with unusual hesitation. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson's face was pale, and he carried himself with the stiff formality of someone bearing unpleasant news. "Sir, you have a call from Colonel Brennan at the Inspector General's office," Peterson announced, his voice carefully neutral. Richardson felt his stomach tighten, though he maintained his outward composure. The Inspector General's office only became involved when serious allegations had been made. He had been expecting this call since the moment his hand had struck Martinez's face, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "Put him through," Richardson said, gesturing for Peterson to close the door behind him as he left. Colonel Brennan's voice was crisp and professional when it came through the phone. "General Richardson, I'm calling to inform you that we have received a formal complaint regarding an incident that allegedly occurred yesterday during training operations at your facility." "I see," Richardson replied, choosing his words carefully. "May I ask the nature of this complaint?" "The allegation is that you physically struck a trainee during a training exercise. I'm sure you understand that we are required to investigate any such claims thoroughly and immediately." Richardson closed his eyes, knowing that his career was beginning to unravel in real time. "I understand, Colonel. What does the investigation process require?" "Effective immediately, you are being relieved of command pending the completion of our investigation. A replacement commanding officer will arrive later today to assume temporary control of the facility. You will remain available for questioning and are not to leave the installation without permission." The conversation continued for another few minutes, covering the technical details of the investigation process, but Richardson barely heard the words. His mind was focused on a single reality. After 4 decades of distinguished service, his career was effectively over. When he hung up the phone, Richardson sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the framed photograph on his desk that showed him receiving the Distinguished Service Medal 3 years earlier. The man in the photograph looked confident, successful, and completely in control of his destiny. That man felt like a stranger now. Meanwhile, Private Martinez was experiencing his own form of upheaval. The young recruit had spent a sleepless night replaying the incident in his mind, touching his still tender cheek, and trying to understand what had happened to him. When his brother Eduardo called him early in the morning, Tommy had been reluctant to discuss the details. "He hit you." Eduardo's voice carried a mixture of outrage and disbelief when Tommy finally explained what had occurred. "A general actually struck you during training?" "It happened so fast," Tommy said quietly. "Maybe I deserved it. Maybe I really am too weak to be here." "Tommy, listen to me," Eduardo said firmly. "No superior officer has the right to strike a subordinate, regardless of the circumstances. What happened to you was wrong, and it was probably illegal." Eduardo Martinez had spent 3 years working as a liaison between the military and civilian media outlets. His job required him to understand both military protocol and public relations, which gave him a unique perspective on situations that could damage the military's reputation. As he listened to his brother's account, he realized that this incident had the potential to become a major scandal. "I want you to document everything you remember," Eduardo told his brother. "Write down exactly what happened, when it happened, and who was present. And I want you to report this through proper channels immediately." "But what if they don't believe me?" Tommy asked. "What if they say I'm lying?" "You won't be alone," Eduardo assured him. "There were witnesses, and incidents like this don't happen in isolation. Trust me, this is bigger than just what happened to you." Eduardo was more right than he realized. As news of the investigation began to spread through the military's internal communications networks, other stories started to surface. Former trainees who had graduated from Richardson's program began to come forward with their own accounts of harsh treatment, psychological abuse, and what some described as systematic brutalization. The first to speak publicly was former Marine Corporal James Sullivan, who had gone through Richardson's training program 2 years earlier. Sullivan had left the military after completing his initial enlistment and was now working as a construction foreman in Ohio. When he read about the investigation in a military newsletter, memories of his own traumatic experiences came flooding back. Sullivan's account, which he shared with a military advocacy group, described a pattern of behavior that went far beyond normal military discipline. He told of recruits being denied medical attention for injuries, of psychological manipulation designed to break down their sense of self-worth, and of a culture where physical intimidation was routinely used to maintain control. Richardson didn't just train soldiers, Sullivan said in a recorded interview. He destroyed people and rebuilt them according to his own twisted vision of what a warrior should be. Some guys came out stronger, but others never recovered from what he put them through. The advocacy group that received Sullivan's testimony was Veterans for Truth, an organization founded by retired military officers who were committed to exposing corruption and abuse within the military system. The group's director, retired Colonel Sandra Hayes, immediately recognized the significance of what Sullivan was telling them. Hayes had been investigating reports of training abuse for several years, but most victims had been reluctant to come forward for fear of retaliation. Richardson's high profile and sterling reputation had made him particularly difficult to challenge. However, the Martinez incident had provided the opening she had been waiting for. "We've been hearing whispers about Richardson's methods for years," Hayes explained to her staff. "But now we have a documented incident, multiple witnesses, and an ongoing official investigation. This could be the chance to expose a system that has been operating without proper oversight for far too long." Within 48 hours of Richardson's removal from command, Veterans for Truth had established a hotline for former trainees to report their experiences. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Stories poured in from across the country, painting a picture of systematic abuse that had been covered up or ignored for years. The stories followed similar patterns. Recruits who showed signs of weakness or struggled with the physical demands of training were singled out for special attention. This attention often took the form of humiliation exercises, extended physical punishment, and psychological manipulation designed to break down their resistance. One particularly disturbing account came from former recruit Sarah Chun, who had been one of the first women to attempt Richardson's program. Chun described being subjected to treatment that was designed to make her quit, including being forced to perform exercises that were beyond her physical capabilities and being subjected to verbal abuse that specifically targeted her gender. "He told me that women had no place in combat roles," Chun recalled. "He said I was taking a spot that belonged to a real soldier, and that my presence was putting everyone else at risk." The psychological pressure was relentless. Chun had eventually completed the program, but the experience had left lasting psychological scars. She had sought counseling after leaving the military and had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder related to her training experiences. As more stories emerged, a pattern became clear. Richardson's training methods were based on the philosophy that only those who could survive extreme physical and psychological pressure deserved to serve in elite military units. However, the line between challenging training and abusive treatment had been crossed repeatedly and systematically. The media attention began slowly, with a brief report in a military trade publication about the ongoing investigation. However, as more victims came forward and the scope of the allegations became apparent, larger news organizations began to take notice. The breakthrough came when investigative reporter Janet Morrison of the Washington Herald decided to pursue the story. Morrison had built her career exposing corruption and abuse in government institutions, and she immediately recognized that the Richardson case had the potential to reveal serious flaws in military oversight systems. Morrison's first article, published 5 days after Richardson's removal from command, was titled "The General's Crucible: Questions Raised About Elite Training Program." The piece provided a detailed account of the Martinez incident and included interviews with several former trainees who described similar experiences. The article had an immediate impact. Within hours of its publication, the story was being discussed on social media platforms, military forums, and news programs. The image of a decorated general slapping a young recruit crystallized public concerns about military training practices and raised questions about how such behavior could have continued for so long without detection. The military's initial response was predictable. A spokesperson issued a statement emphasizing that the allegations were being investigated thoroughly and that the military did not tolerate abuse of any kind. However, the statement also included language defending the importance of rigorous training standards, which many interpreted as an attempt to justify Richardson's methods. This defensive posture only served to intensify public interest in the story. Additional news organizations began assigning reporters to investigate the case, and the trickle of former trainees coming forward became a flood. The political implications of the scandal were significant. Senator Margaret Thornton, who served on the Senate Armed Services Committee, announced that she would be holding hearings to examine training practices throughout the military. Thornton had built her political career on advocating for military families and veterans' rights, and the Richardson case provided her with a perfect platform to push for reforms. The men and women who volunteer to serve our country deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, Thornton declared at a press conference. If these allegations are true, they represent a fundamental betrayal of the values that our military is supposed to embody. The hearings were scheduled to begin within 2 weeks, and Thornton's staff began issuing subpoenas for documents and witness testimony. Richardson himself would be required to testify, along with current and former members of his staff. As the controversy grew, Richardson found himself confined to his quarters for most of each day, emerging only for meetings with military lawyers and investigators. The isolation gave him time to reflect on his career and the choices that had led him to this point. He began to understand that his downfall was not just the result of a single moment of lost control, but rather the inevitable consequence of a system he had created and maintained for years. His training methods had been based on the belief that extreme measures were justified by extreme results, but he had never considered the human cost of his approach. The investigation was moving quickly, driven by the high-profile nature of the case and the pressure from political leaders and the media. Military investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed training records, and examined policies and procedures that had governed the facility for years. What they found was a comprehensive system designed to operate with minimal external oversight. Richardson had cultivated relationships with his superiors that allowed him significant autonomy in running his programs. This autonomy, combined with his reputation for producing exceptional soldiers, had created an environment where his methods went largely unquestioned. The investigation also revealed that several previous complaints about training practices had been filed but had not resulted in significant action. These complaints had been handled through internal channels and had typically resulted in minor adjustments to procedures rather than fundamental changes to the program. As the scope of the investigation expanded and more evidence came to light, it became clear that Richardson's case was not an isolated incident, but rather representative of broader problems within military training systems. The 5-second slap that had started everything was revealing cracks that ran throughout the entire structure. 3 months after the slap heard around the military world, General Marcus Richardson sat in a sparse conference room in the Pentagon, facing a panel of senior officers who would determine his fate. The man who had once commanded respect and fear in equal measure now appeared diminished, his uniform bearing the same decorations but somehow carrying less authority than before. The court-martial proceedings had drawn media attention unlike anything the military had seen in years. Outside the building, protesters and supporters had gathered, creating a circus atmosphere that military officials desperately wanted to avoid. Inside, the methodical process of military justice was playing out with devastating efficiency. Colonel Sandra Hayes of Veterans for Truth had become the unofficial spokesperson for Richardson's victims. Her organization had documented over 200 separate allegations of abuse spanning Richardson's entire career as a training commander. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of systematic brutality that had been hidden behind the veneer of military excellence. This case represents more than just one general's fall from grace, Hayes told reporters during a break in the proceedings. It exposes a culture that has allowed abuse to flourish under the guise of creating elite warriors. How many young people have been damaged by these methods? How many potential soldiers were driven away from service by treatment that crossed every line of human decency? The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of a training system that had operated without meaningful oversight for over a decade. Witness after witness testified about experiences that went far beyond appropriate military discipline, describing scenarios that sounded more like torture than training. Private Martinez himself had become a reluctant symbol of military abuse. His testimony, delivered in a quiet voice that sometimes cracked with emotion, provided the court with a detailed account of the incident that had started the investigation. The young man had lost significant weight since the event, and his demeanor suggested someone who had been fundamentally changed by his experience. "I joined the military to serve my country," Martinez testified. "I expected training to be difficult, and I was prepared to be pushed beyond my limits. But I never expected to be treated as less than human. The general didn't just hit me that day. He destroyed my belief that the military was a place where I could belong." The defense team, led by one of the military's most experienced trial lawyers, attempted to present Richardson's actions within the context of his distinguished career. They argued that his methods, while harsh, had produced exceptional soldiers who had served with distinction in combat zones around the world. General Richardson dedicated his life to preparing young Americans for the ultimate test, combat against enemies who would show no mercy, the defense attorney argued. His methods were demanding because the stakes were life and death. Should we condemn a man who saved countless lives by ensuring that only the truly prepared entered the battlefield? The defense called several former trainees who credited Richardson's program with making them better soldiers and better people. These witnesses described the training as transformative, arguing that the harsh treatment had been necessary to prepare them for the realities of military service. However, these positive testimonies were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of evidence presented by the prosecution. The investigation had uncovered documentation that painted a disturbing picture of Richardson's evolution from a demanding but fair commander to someone who had become increasingly detached from the human cost of his methods. Email exchanges between Richardson and his staff revealed discussions about breaking difficult recruits and weeding out those deemed unfit for service. Medical records showed an unusual number of injuries and psychological breaks among trainees in his program, with many of these incidents attributed to training accidents or personal weaknesses rather than systemic problems. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Dr. Emily Warren, a military psychologist who had worked at the facility for 2 years before requesting a transfer. Dr. Warren described a culture where mental health concerns were dismissed as weaknesses and where trainees showing signs of psychological distress were subjected to additional punishment rather than receiving appropriate care. "I repeatedly raised concerns about the psychological impact of the training methods being employed," Dr. Warren testified. "These concerns were dismissed, and I was told that my job was to identify weaknesses, not to coddle soldiers. When I pressed the issue, I was told that perhaps I wasn't suited for military service myself." The investigation had also revealed a disturbing pattern of cover-ups and intimidation. Several former staff members testified about being pressured to downplay incidents or to alter reports to minimize the appearance of problems. This conspiracy of silence had allowed Richardson's system to operate without meaningful challenge for years. The political ramifications of the case extended far beyond Richardson himself. Senator Thornton's hearings had revealed that similar problems existed at other training facilities throughout the military. The Richardson case had become a catalyst for a broader examination of military training practices and oversight mechanisms. The hearings had featured testimony from military officials, training experts, and advocacy groups, all painting a picture of a system that had prioritized results over methods. The pressure to produce effective soldiers had created an environment where abuse could flourish as long as it produced the desired outcomes. "We have created a culture where the ends justify any means," Senator Thornton declared during one particularly heated session. "We have allowed a generation of military leaders to believe that brutality and excellence are synonymous. This must stop, and it must stop now." The media coverage of the case had been relentless and largely unsympathetic to Richardson. The image of a powerful general striking a young recruit had crystallized public anger about military abuse, and Richardson had become a symbol of everything wrong with military culture. Investigative reporters had uncovered additional stories that painted Richardson in an increasingly negative light. Former colleagues described a man who had become increasingly isolated and autocratic over the years, someone who had surrounded himself with subordinates who were afraid to challenge his methods. The personal cost to Richardson was evident to anyone who observed him during the proceedings. The confident, commanding figure who had once dominated every room he entered had been replaced by a man who seemed to shrink a little more each day. His family had been subjected to intense media scrutiny, and his wife had stopped attending the proceedings after receiving death threats from people outraged by her husband's actions. The military's reputation had suffered significant damage as well. Recruiting numbers had dropped as parents questioned whether they wanted their children subjected to training methods that seemed more appropriate for enemy interrogation than military preparation. The service was facing a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond Richardson's individual case. As the court-martial neared its conclusion, it became clear that Richardson's conviction was inevitable. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the political pressure for accountability was intense. The question was not whether he would be found guilty, but rather what punishment would be imposed. The prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty, dismissal from service, forfeiture of all benefits, and confinement. They argued that Richardson's actions represented a fundamental betrayal of military values, and that only the harshest punishment would send an appropriate message to other commanders. The defense team made a final appeal for leniency, emphasizing Richardson's decades of distinguished service and the combat veterans whose lives had been saved by the training they received in his programs. They argued that while his methods had been flawed, his intentions had been honorable. The panel of officers deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. General Marcus Richardson was found guilty of assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and dereliction of duty. The sentence was devastating: dismissal from service, forfeiture of all retirement benefits, and 1 year of confinement. The verdict sent shockwaves through the military establishment. A general officer had not been dismissed from service for criminal conduct in over 2 decades, and Richardson's fall served as a stark reminder that no one was above accountability. For Private Martinez, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but little satisfaction. The young man had left the military during the investigation, unable to continue his service after the trauma he had experienced. He struggled with depression and anxiety related to his military experience, and had begun working with a counselor to address the psychological impact of his time in Richardson's program. "I didn't want to destroy anyone's career," Martinez said in a statement released after the verdict. "I just wanted to serve my country. But what happened to me was wrong, and I'm glad that the system finally recognized that." The broader impact of the Richardson case continued to unfold long after the court-martial concluded. The military implemented sweeping reforms to its training programs, including mandatory oversight mechanisms, regular psychological evaluations for both trainers and trainees, and clear protocols for reporting abuse. These reforms came at a significant cost. Several training programs were suspended or completely redesigned, leading to delays in preparing soldiers for deployment. The military struggled to maintain its training standards while ensuring that abusive practices were eliminated. Veterans for Truth expanded its operations significantly in the wake of the Richardson case, establishing support networks for military abuse victims and continuing to investigate reports of misconduct throughout the military system. The organization had become a powerful advocate for reform, using Richardson's case as a springboard for broader changes. The training facility where the incident had occurred was eventually closed and converted to other uses. The obstacle course where Martinez had struggled became overgrown with weeds, a silent monument to a system that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Richardson himself served his sentence at a military prison, where he was isolated from other inmates for his own protection. The man who had once commanded thousands of soldiers found himself confined to a small cell, with nothing but time to reflect on the choices that had led to his downfall. Letters from former students occasionally reached him, some expressing gratitude for the training they had received, others describing the lasting damage his methods had caused. These letters served as a constant reminder of the complex legacy he had created, a system that had produced exceptional soldiers while destroying others in the process. Upon his release, Richardson faced a world that had moved on without him. His military pension was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and his prospects for employment were virtually non-existent. The man who had once been considered one of the military's rising stars had become unemployable, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. The ripple effects of that 5-second slap continued to spread years after the incident. Military training programs throughout the world examined their own practices, seeking to avoid the fate that had befallen Richardson and his system. The case became a touchstone for discussions about the balance between effective training and humane treatment. Private Martinez eventually found his way to a different form of service, working with a veterans advocacy organization to help other military abuse survivors. His experience had scarred him, but it had also given him a unique perspective on the importance of accountability and reform. The training ground where everything had started remained empty, a testament to how quickly and completely a system built over decades could collapse. The 5 seconds it had taken for Richardson to slap Martinez had unleashed consequences that continued to unfold years later, proving that even the most established institutions were vulnerable to the actions of individuals who lost sight of their responsibilities to those under their command. In the end, Richardson's story became a powerful reminder that authority without accountability was simply another form of tyranny, and that the true measure of military leadership was not the fear one could inspire, but the respect one could earn through ethical conduct and genuine concern for the welfare of subordinates.